Hi, we complete 1 Samuel 30 today after David has recovered all that the Amalekites took from his town of Ziklag and has come back to the Wadi Besor to the 200 men who were too exhausted to cross over and participate in the battle. So before we enter the scene, as you can see on the right side of the screen, I have the key words for this chapter up. And in the section we're going to look at now, this last paragraph, there aren't a lot of key words other than the theme of spoil. Because what we're going to see in this paragraph is David having successfully shown, at least symbolically, that he or someone like him is capable of restoring people from exile in the symbolic language we saw in the first 4 verses that echoed language from exile. Now he's going to act as king. And we're going to see it at the end. And the key to that is to understand that the scene here where David is acting as king is simultaneous to where Saul is being told yet again that Yahweh has withdrawn his royal approval of Saul as he tries to contact Samuel from the dead, and here's that negative response. So we've been looking at the scenes that we've been looking at here in chapter 30 about David are simultaneous to the scenes in chapter 28 and 31 with Saul. And that's the way that the writers here are contrasting Saul's deep fear and Yahweh's absence from him with David's purported relationship with Yahweh that we looked at a couple of videos ago around the question of the ephod, and now what kind of justice he'll provide for people. So do we want someone like David to be king, or is he just in it for himself? And that's what this passage is about here. So our passage is situated near the end of the large chiasm that comprises the second half of 1 Samuel, starting with the symbolic death of Saul the king when Yahweh regrets him and Samuel cuts off his royal robes, and then the physical death of Saul and Jonathan that we'll see in the next chapter. So as we've been noting throughout this unit, chiastically, we see this alternation between David and Saul and then David and Saul, and that's to accommodate the possibility of this simultaneity here. So also the chapters in 27 and 29, which surround the chapter in 26, were about David, but were one continuous unit. So that's why we've gone 27, 29, and 30, and then we'll go back and look at 28 and 31. So let's just jump right into our passage. And I have up on the left side the last verse from the previous video, so we can see it ended with David having captured not only what was taken, but Amalekite materials that then are further spoil. So obviously what he brought back that was taken would not be as spoil. That would be returned to the people from whom it was taken. But now the spoil is what he's taken from the Amalekites who he's destroyed. So as we get back to the wadi, to the brook here, we find this. David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow David, interestingly repeated twice there, and who had been left at the brook or Wadi Besor. They went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. When David drew near to the people, he saluted them. We need to look at a couple aspects of that. One is an interesting element. There's 5 different verbs of movement in this verse, and you can see them below in the Hebrew, and I won't go over all of them in the Hebrew, but it's plainly highlighting a number of ways in which this meeting almost symbolically or liturgically takes place. As David appears, the people go out to meet him, and to meet the people who are with him, and then David draws near. And the saluting here is to say he asked about their welfare or peace, using shalom here. But he asked, which is to say he salled. So he salled about their shalom here, and that's going to be important because we'll see in chapter 28 simultaneously, Saul is salling for Samuel. So while Saul is asking desperately for Samuel, David is asking about the condition of his people. He's serving as a master who cares about his people, as purported here. But the narrator already taking a strong editorial position, which is rarely taken here, and it's really highlighting the perspective on David that is being shown here, starting in verse 22. And as my note below has, the narrator's judgment determines how we interpret this scene. And it begins with all the corrupt and worthless fellows. Samora suggests as a hendiadys of these two words, Ra for evil, and Belial, which is at one level a proper noun, but it means corrupt or worthless, and we'll look at where that's found elsewhere. But the 2 examples he gives of it being a hendiadys, where the 2 terms are together to express one concept, actually in 2 Samuel 16:7 or in 21 are not both there. Let's look briefly here. We see in 2 Samuel 16, Shammai shouted out at David, out, murderer, scoundrel, which is Belial. So he's calling David that. And in the other one, just a couple chapters later, we see the narrator calls Sheba a son of Belial here. But there's nothing about evil there. So it's really not a hendiadys, as Samora suggests. They're 2 separate words. And Belial we've seen before. Let's look at it in 1 and 2 Samuel. So we saw it earlier, where Abigail referred to her husband Nabal as a son of Belial. And then we saw earlier on, going backwards here, some sons of Belial questioned whether Saul could be the king for them, and they despised him and brought him no present, which is key here because there's going to be a present at the heart of our current scene. And then we saw back at the very beginning where Hannah said to Eli, who mistook her praying for her being drunk, "Do not regard your servant as a daughter or a woman of Belial" there. We'll see it also in 2 Samuel in the two examples I just showed you from Shammai and Sheba, but also in the psalm-like element here in 22:5, and also in that in 23:6. So this is the last time in 1 Samuel we're going to see this here. So let's put our keywords back up and we'll get into our story here. So after this sort of liturgical procession as they come together, these people come out and suggest this. Because they did not go with us, which is to say the 200 exhausted men, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may take his wife and children and leave, which is to say they can recover it. And the word here is not take. It's the unpronounceable, not the vowels word, NHG there, to drive, and hence some translations have to lead them away. But they refuse to share the spoils. And notice a couple elements here. They believe it's in their power to make the decision, and we realize we're not clear on what the authority is here. David is not a king to them in this point, and he's a leader, but he has no official authority of any kind. Even official authority is hardly official. Saul, for example, is officially king, but Yahweh is also officially withdrawn his support for him. So is he king or is he not? So we'll look at that criteria, those questions more in 2 Samuel when the monarchy takes on a more formal structure, especially in the time of Solomon, a generation later. But for now, that's the question, is do these people have the authority to decide that it's up to them to decide or not? And the text has David respond to them, not that he's their servant or that they're his servants or slaves, but as brothers. It's a very interesting response. He could have tried to claim that they were the servants of him, as we've seen several people referred to as servants of Saul, including David referring to himself as a servant of Saul, even to Saul. But here he calls them brothers. So he's appealing to them as family and kin, which is quite a rhetorically smart thing to do, trying to suggest that if we're all family, then we share. But he goes on. That's only one element of his attempt at persuasion here. He goes on and just announces this like it's a fact, with what you shall not do so, my brothers, with what, which is to say the spoil, that Yahweh has given us. Yahweh has preserved us, or literally watched over us, used 16 times in Samuel, framing with 2:9. We'll come back to that in just a minute. And handed over to us the raiding party that attacked us, or literally given over to us the raiding party into our hands, or handed over to us. It's not clear from the Hebrew which direction we should understand the causation there, either that came into our hands via Yahweh's doing, or that Yahweh handed over to us. But in either case, that's David claiming that. We've not seen Yahweh doing that, other than that David used the ephod, which we looked at a couple videos ago, to suggest it was the Lot-like choice from the Urim and Thummim that would give a yes or no answer to his question. So he's interpreting the fact that the Urim and Thummim on the ephod gave him a yes answer, and he went in and succeeded as causation. But it could also be correlation. We didn't hear Yahweh speak, and the narrator didn't tell us it was Yahweh. So this is David claiming a theological basis for what has happened here that may or may not be the quote-unquote fact. But by doing that, he's suggesting that the sons of Belial here, the evil and corrupt ones, if you will, are opposing Yahweh, the one who has given them the victory. So it's quite a nice rhetorical piece on David's part, and they don't argue. But he's not done yet. He goes on to say, who would listen to you in this matter? Literally from the Hebrew, and who would listen to this word of yours? Which is to suggest that, is that the criterion? That only the people who go into battle get a share, but people who do something else, or are simply too weak or tired, don't get anything? That's the criterion that's at issue here. And David announces it like it's just a clear criterion with no argument. For the share of the one who goes down to the battle shall be the same as the share of the one who stays by the baggage. The Kelly, which we've heard earlier, and as the lexicon, the Brown Driver Griggs lexicon suggests, it's a wider word for personal or household property. And as my note below says, David makes it sound like they were carrying out an important task rather than simply being exhausted. We've seen other times that it is a task to stay by the baggage. In fact, Saul was hiding among the baggage when Yahweh told Samuel to anoint him, and David has also been among the baggage in other situations. That certainly would be a role to protect all the property of the soldiers. But that's not what they were doing. At least we weren't told that's what we were doing. We were told they were simply too exhausted to go on and they were resting. So David establishes a principle not that those who are too tired get a share, but that going into the battle or taking care of what we might call an administrative task or some other task entitles one to an equal share of the spoil. And as the final close of his phrase is, they shall share alike, using the echo in these couple of places. Let's go back and look at a couple of the details that I'd noted we'd look at. So under the watching, using shemer as the verb to watch, let's go back at 16 times in 1 Samuel, but this is a close parallel here, noting that our book is drawing us back to holding all of it together as a continuous narrative. So back in 2:9, we heard from Hannah's song, Yahweh will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness, for not by might does one prevail. And isn't that an interesting parallel? Because the guarding here is what's at issue here. Guarding the feet is in 22:37, but he has guarded us or watched over us. But in Hannah's song, it was, the Lord does not prevail by might, and that's exactly how David has prevailed, by killing all the Amalekites. So alert readers might go back and question that. Is Yahweh really saving through this military battle, through what I call the religion of empire, or is there a seed of doubt all the way back to Hannah's song, echoed, of course, in Mary's Magnificat in Luke's Gospel? So, continuing back where we were, from that day forward he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel, clearly establishing David like a king, like a lawmaker king who can do this. And as the narrator adds, it continues to the present day. The second time we've heard that, suggesting which present day. Certainly that seems to be the present day of the end of monarchy, of exile, or the time under Persian control of the restored province of Yehud, where the Persians sponsored the rebuilding of Jerusalem, that I've been suggesting in this unit from 27 to 31 is the time of composition of these chapters, if not the whole book of 1 Samuel. So David is being established as a just king at exactly the same time that Saul is before the woman in great fear, uselessly calling upon Samuel. But the narrator, or the writer here, is not done portraying David as a just king. Because when we looked at it as a statute and ordinance, this is his justice. As Bert suggests, an action we would expect of a king, but mishpat is the word for justice, although it can mean several things. Let's look at it. We saw it earlier, back in chapter 27. It's translated as practice, but I didn't put this chart back up, so let's look at it now. This shows it all the way through. A couple examples from Genesis, translated as righteousness, or just as you used to do, making it something like practice, or the ways. But we also see it in Exodus, where Yahweh made it for them a statute and ordinance, echoing the exact same phrase we see here, using the same language. So there Yahweh did it, and here David's doing it, acting exactly in the role of Yahweh. Isn't that an interesting criterion? We'll see it in 2 Samuel around the question of Absalom, who wants to claim this role in his rebellion against his father, attempting to use that to get popular support. And then again in the psalm down in the end, we see the two words again there. There'll be other examples in 1 Kings of the 30 uses, but I just want to highlight here how it can be translated, either as ordinances, statutes, or rules, as judgment, as the act of executing justice, or as the process of discerning what justice is. So it has a wide range of meanings, but clearly the authors are suggesting that David is creating a just law because nobody has changed it to whatever that present day is. So now we come to the closing part of this, and it's a fascinating set of details here. We see David not only legislating like a king, but being a patron like a king, providing things for his network that, just like a good congressperson might bring back the goodies for their district, especially for the elite in their district who might be campaign donors or otherwise supporters, establishing the kind of quid pro quo that leads people to support you when there's an election. David won't have to face election, but he will have to face the question of whether people support his authority. So he's planting strong seeds here to establish that basis. So let's look at some of the details here. As Bodner notes below, thus David's last activity during his long period as a fugitive in the wilderness is generally to dole out gifts to his future constituents. That surely paves the way for being crowned king of Judah. And as Uriah Kim also notes, he has been trying to woo the allegiance from the leaders of Judah since the beginning of his wilderness period in order to establish his base there. And notice the words that are used here that hadn't been used before. When David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to his friends. That's not in the Masoretic or the Septuagint, but the Septuagint has plesion, which is neighbors. But both the Hebrew and the Greek have elders here. In Hebrew, the word for elders is simply graybeards, and that's contrasting with the simultaneous issue of Samuel being old as well. So notice, while Saul is going to Samuel and getting nothing, David is providing support for the elders of Judah. And here's what he says to them. Here is a present, or literally a blessing, barakah, for you from the spoil of the enemies of Yahweh. Two things we need to note about that. One is it echoes what Abigail did in 25:27, offering David and his men a blessing of all kinds of food and things to get them to not kill her and to be on her side. But blessing otherwise, especially in Genesis, is fertility. It's not material wealth. So here in the voice of David, matching Abigail's voice, is blessing as material wealth. And that's really quite a contrast here. We'll see in the religion of creation, as we see in Genesis, blessing is what God provides directly, the fertility of the earth or the fertility of the human body, which can also mean water in a dry place, whether that's the dry place of a woman's genitals or the dry place of the land of Israel itself, but also of the fertility that provides food, etc. So here, blessing is turned into just material reward, and that's very different, much like we might hear in certain kinds of Christian prosperity gospels to this day. But if they get it, they're not getting that from Jesus. It's not really Christian in any way. It's part of the religion of empire. And it's named as a blessing for you from the spoil of the enemies of Yahweh, which is, say, from Amalek. And we looked last time at the backstory of why Amalek was described as this ultimate enemy that Yahweh wanted destroyed. We won't look at the details of these places, and most of them are unknown. They're only mentioned here. We know nothing about them. The details of that aren't the point. Oh, well, they look at Bethel. The detail is what it follows at the end here. All the places, let's get down there so we can see it, where David and men has roamed, or literally where they went. So in all the time that he was wandering around, staying away from Saul, and even perhaps while he was working for Asich, he was planting seeds for what he knew was coming. That whatever way it was that Saul would die, Saul would eventually die, and David would just take his turn. And that sets up part of the suspicious element that we've been looking at here of whether David already knows that Saul's going to die because he'll be responsible for it. As we've been looking at, the scenes with David take place down here in Ziklag, and here's the Nahal or the Wadi Besor there. So they've been in this area where Saul and the Philistines are up here. Here's Endor, where in chapter 28 Saul is consulting the woman, and then Gilboa, where the mountain is, where he takes on the Philistines, and the Philistines kill him and his son Jonathan and other sons we've not heard of before. We'll get to there very soon. That's up here. So as I've been noting, a number of scholars suggest the text is really assuring us that David wasn't responsible for the death of Saul, and yet maybe he still was. And the fact that he's doing all these things suggests that he understands that he's going to come into his reign very soon, and that might suggest support for the idea that he knows that while he's doing this, Saul is going to die in battle. So let's look at the two places that frame these otherwise obscure places. One is Bethel, and that's really important here. We've seen Bethel before. I can look at a couple of examples of it back in 1 Samuel 10. We saw it here. 3 men going up to God at Bethel in what he's told from Samuel. We also see it in chapter 13 here. Saul chose 3,000 men out of Israel, 2,000 were Saul at Mishmash in the hill country of Bethel. So there it's simply a place as part of the situation of Saul's reign right here. The reason it's going to be important later, especially in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, is that after the rebellion against Solomon's son Rehoboam, his successor Jeroboam, who will rule Israel in the north, will establish a shrine to worship Yahweh in Bethel. And that will be blasphemous to the upholders of the Jerusalem temple in Judah, and the Judahites who write really the whole books of Kings. And so it will be seen as an abomination, or described as a sin of Jeroboam, and in the reign of of Josiah in the late 7th century BCE, it will be destroyed. Let's look at two examples of that so we can see. In 1 Kings 12:29, we see this one. This is where Jeroboam set up an altar in Bethel, and the narrator describes exactly what I was saying, and this became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one at Bethel and before the other one as far as Dan, as opposed to worshiping in the Jerusalem temple. And then we see here in 2 Kings 23, where the king Josiah commanded the high priest Hilkiah, etc., to bring out all these vessels associated with other gods and carry their ashes to Bethel. And if we read that story in more detail, we'll see he also had priests killed at Bethel who are not necessarily worshiping anybody other than Yahweh, but their sin was to worship outside of Jerusalem, much like the Catholic Church at the height of the Reformation would have condemned Protestant ministers, not because they're worshiping a different God or a different Lord, but because they're worshiping in the wrong place and under the wrong sense of authority. So we see that at the beginning, and then we see Hebron at the end. And as Brueggemann notes, the first place where David will finally come into his power, but associated with Abraham. So as Bethel is associated in Genesis with Jacob, who, when he gets there, has the experience of the angels going up and down on the ramp and declares Yahweh was in this place, but I didn't know it, which may well be an exilic criticism of what Josiah did. But Hebron is associated with Abraham positively and never negatively. Let's look at these two examples. In 13:18, we see that he moved his tents and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and then later it'll be associated with the burial place here. Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is at Hebron, and Hebron will be the place also described as where Machpelah is, the cave that he gets from the Hittites. So Hebron will be important, and it becomes the place from which David establishes his reign. And why are all these other places named? To really highlight that David has established a wide range of support. And so when Saul is dead, David will be all set to go and to take his reign. Next time we'll continue, we'll go back to chapter 28 before we get to the death of Saul and see while David was establishing the basis for his monarchy, Saul was desperately trying to hold on to anything and getting nothing. See you for that next time. Bye.